Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the podcast. We are now officially on the Monday schedule. Call it the Monday Monologues. I hope you all had a great Thanksgiving. I know I did. We went up to Chicago. I have some family up there. It was my mom's sister's 80th birthday. So the whole extended family on that side of the family came together. It was really a fun time. I hope you had a great Thanksgiving if you are an American, and just a great week if you don't happen to be an American. One thing that I am thankful for is you. Thanks to all of you for being great listeners of the podcast. The listenership continues to grow. I now have over 300 ratings on iTunes, a 5-star rating. Thank you very much. If you've not yet left a rating on iTunes, please do. I've also gotten some great reviews, great feedback people have sent. A couple reviews, I'll just quote them for you right here. This is the most recent one. If I could only listen to one podcast, this would be it. So thank you very much. Someone else said, Aaron continues to consistently provide excellent content. He refuses to be pigeonholed, and he doesn't let his listeners off the hook for our own potential blind spots. So again, thank you. It's great. Really appreciate the feedback. And then just one more. Aaron Wren puts in serious effort to learn about important issues and introduce the audience to things you won't hear elsewhere. So again, thank you. And I do put a lot of effort into that. And I mentioned in my last newsletter that during the Christmas season, I was going to be doing a membership and subscriber drive as people decide, who they're going to support, what they're going to buy during the course of 2022. So in the podcast through the end of the year, I'm going to be mentioning that and making my pitch to you. And, we live in an unprecedented time in America for men in the church. Just being Christian men today, it's a place no American man has ever found himself. We live in what I now call the negative world. That is, the world, society at large, now views Christianity negatively. Whereas it used to view Christianity positively throughout much of American history, and then for a while it kind of viewed it neutrally, now it views it negatively. And how do we navigate this world? This is the place we do that. Most Christian ministries and personalities today came out of the environment of the positive world or the neutral world, but this is the place where we can go to look and see about the negative world. And, to really devote the time it takes to be able to do the research and the analysis and the study to be able to develop the kinds of next level insights that I can provide around how to understand and navigate this world that we live in, it takes a lot of time. And for me to be able to devote that time, I need to have the amount of financial support it takes to be able to dedicate that amount of time to it. So, thanks to those of you who are already financial supporters. If you had not been a financial supporter, it's fair to say I would not be doing this. This would have all been shut down a long time ago. So thank you. You have made this possible. For those of you who are not yet supporters, I hope that you will consider becoming a supporter as I roll out a new reward structure. So I kind of previously had limited rewards for my patrons, and things that I had heard over and over again from my Patreon, from my Gumroad supporters was, Aaron, we don't want exclusive stuff. We don't want that stuff. We want to make this available to the largest possible audience. And that's been great, but realistically, most people want something in return for giving something. And so I've tried to put together a structure that honors what my existing donors have always wanted while providing real benefits to people who join going forward. So in 2022, starting in January, I'm going to be rolling out a new structure and basically going to be kind of 2 tiers. One, you can become a subscriber. And if you're a subscriber, you will get access to exclusive content. You will get access to podcast transcripts. I'm going to start providing transcripts. You will get access to audio versions of the first 4 years of the newsletter as I record them. So I did not create podcasts of the first 4 years of the Masculinists. I've been recording those. 20 of them are now done, and you'll be able to get that. And commenting is probably going to be restricted to only subscribers. So becoming a subscriber, and I'll probably use Substack, but if you sign up now, you'll definitely be in the system. It's going to be $10 a month to be a subscriber, but through the end of the year, you can become a subscriber for $5 a month. So to do that, just go to patreon.com/masculinist or gumroad.com/masculinist and sign up today. Members, to become a member, you will get all the benefits of being a subscriber. Plus, I'm going to do a couple or maybe more Zoom calls exclusively for members. These will be very interactive, unlike the podcasts. And unlike the live interviews, it won't just be live chats in the chat stream. We'll be able to just have live interactive discussion. So Q&A, coaching, self-improvement, maybe more commentary on current events, and book discussions. I'm planning on doing book discussions. And this will be the place where maybe the things that I'm not yet ready to say, maybe I can't say publicly. Maybe I'll be able to be a little more edgy in these discussions. That's where I'm going to do that. Probably a mix of daytime and evening for different time zone people, what works best for them. And then we're going to have like a private chat group, either in Slack, Telegram, Discord, something like that. Probably depend on what the people want, but we'll have like a private chat group for just members. So membership's going to be very great. And to be a member starting in 2022 will be $50 a month, but through the end of the year, you could get in for $35 a month. So again, you can go to patreon.com/masculinist and gumroad.com/masculinist. Again, you can think of this as a donation if you want, but the reality is that there is going to be real value for money in this. So stay tuned for that. I was talking with someone the other day about the need to create a new Protestant elite. And by that, I don't mean a establishment like in the old days when Protestants essentially had almost exclusive control over America. I'm just saying we need Protestants who are elite, who are self-consciously Protestant, formed in that tradition, who are able to participate at the highest levels of society in America from that Protestant perspective. And, again, this podcast is turning into a podcast series on elites. And in fact, I got one more. I thought I only had one more in this series, but then I came up with this one based on this discussion. And so I did it. And then maybe next week will be the last one. But I want to talk a little bit more about elites. And again, I'm going to focus on Protestants because, as I noted, with political conservatism and other areas, Catholics have actually done pretty well in building up an elite cadre who've, now a lot of Supreme Court justices are Catholic, for example. A lot of the heads of these conservative organizations are Catholic. There are a lot of influential Catholics. The President of the United States is Catholic. So they have done, very well. And we're studying. I don't know that as well. And so I'm not going to comment on it just because I don't know it. I'm going to focus on Protestants because I think this is where we need to have some improvement because we have a deficiency in Protestant elites, certainly those who are more orthodox in their faith. And so I called this podcast An Elite Church for the Elite, which was sort of a riff off of Pope, I think it was Pope Francis. It was some Catholic who said, we need to be a poor church for the poor. And so I said, well, how about an elite church for the elite? Just as a sort of a provocation, perhaps, but to get people thinking about that. And I was thinking about it in terms of, is it a valid thing to have a church that is self-consciously targeting the elite? I was just thinking about this. If I said, I'm starting a church, I'm starting a new church, and we really want to reach the homeless, people would love that. They'd be all over that. If I said, we really want to reach this new immigrant ethnic group in our city that has started moving here, we really want to serve that community and evangelize that community, man, people be all over that. If I said I wanted to reach, this neighborhood, all right, we need to reach the neighborhood. We need to have neighborhood missional focus. Or if I said, hey, I want to create a multicultural church. I want to create a multicultural. I'm really trying to create a multicultural church. People would love that. You can target all sorts of different things. But if I kind of stood up and said, hey, you know what I want to do? I really want to start a church that's going to reach the most elite people in this community. People probably look at you sideways like, what are you talking about here? It almost seems to be a category of thought that doesn't exist in sort of conservative Protestantism. And, I just think that's interesting. It almost seems to be, again, something that we consider almost invalid. Even as I say it, I'm like, it doesn't really sound, it just kind of sounds kind of foreign. And, again, I'm not talking about the church as a whole here. I'm only talking about, like an individual congregation or congregations. Are we targeting the elite? And, it's interesting that the traditional mainline denominations that served the elite are very comfortable with being elite. There are, Episcopalian churches, Presbyterian churches, that they're just very comfortable in their own skin as essentially the home for the country club set. Now, I'm not saying that all those churches are elite. In fact, the Episcopal church that I have personally attended the most number of times of any Episcopal church in my life is a extremely small, essentially marginally, barely hanging on congregation in the poorest neighborhood in Philadelphia, right? So there are definitely, Episcopal parishes that do not fit the elite model, but there are plenty that do. And, if you look at them, they seem to be, pretty comfortable in that. During the pandemic, I actually spent some time, looking at services of various mainline Presbyterian flagship congregations from around the country. And I didn't always check out the whole service, but I'm like, what are they doing? What are they looking at? I'd like to get a sense of what the preaching's like, all this stuff. And it kind of gives you a sense. You can just see these churches, they just seem comfortable in their own skin as what they are, right? We are kind of a large, wealthy, upscale church. This is what we do. Here's the values we have. And they're much more comfortable in that. So I think the more kind of conservative denominations seem much, much less comfortable with that. They're always trying to sort of talk about how they're not trying to be that, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think it's interesting that a lot of even politically conservative elites are Episcopalian. Tucker Carlson is an example of that, right? He comes from this, WASP background, as an heir to the Swanson frozen food fortune. He's sort of a cradle Episcopalian. Again, I don't know him personally, but he's written that, he seems to be pretty serious in his faith. And I can name a number of other, well-placed, prominent, conservative, politically conservative people who, I happen to know are sort of very theologically orthodox, traditional people who are Episcopalians. Now, I'm not going to tell you who they are because none of these people really talk about it publicly. It's not necessarily easy to find out that these guys are Episcopalian. They're almost like Episcopalian on the down low. It's like you don't necessarily know exactly what they are, but there seems to be quite a few of them, to the extent that there are Protestants in elite positions in sort of political movement conservative, for example. They tend to be Episcopalians. And in fact, I even know one entire super elite Episcopal parish in one of these coastal elite global cities that actually seems to be mostly very theologically conservative people. And I mean, I know there are other Episcopal parishes I'm sort of aware of that, and I think there's even a kind of a conservative Episcopal seminary. One of their seminaries is still kind of conservative. But this is one that really is in a very fashionable area, and it's the place where you go if you're kind of a more conservative guy. And there's a lot of them of there. And, I find it interesting to think about that, because there's been this movement towards creating a parallel Anglican structure in the United States. There is a denomination now called ACNA, I think that's how they pronounce it, the Anglican Church in North America, which is a combination of various, it's sort of a mishmash of various organizations. It does include some Episcopal parishes who left. It includes a lot of new sort of church plants, if you want to call it that, more progressively oriented church plants. It includes, kind of North American churches that were part of some African dioceses and things like that. And so I get the impression, I'm not going to go too much detail because I'm an expert, how the Eastern Orthodox Church here in the United States, they've got all these overlapping jurisdictions because they could never agree on creating one jurisdiction. But basically, a lot of the people who were kind of this Anglican tradition, who were outside of the Episcopal Church, mostly because they thought it was way too liberal for them, kind of did manage to squeeze themselves into a denomination called ACNA. I don't believe it's recognized by the Church of England itself. And, as one person told me about it, it's still in its Articles of Confederation phase. So we'll see what happens there. But it seems to be there. And I think it's interesting that these super elite people I know have not really been drawn to ACNA. They have decided to stay Episcopalian. In fact, I think Tucker Carlson has, given interviews and written articles about why are you an Episcopalian, Tucker? He talks about it, so you can look those up if you want. And split offs. I think part of it is split offs are almost inherently subaltern, right? They're lower status, and this is a big challenge, especially in the Episcopal Church, because of property ownership. So in the major denominations, certainly in the Episcopal Church, in the Presbyterian Church, and I believe in the Methodist Church, the way that the property is structured is that the local congregation owns the property, but it's held in trust for the denomination, which means de facto the denomination owns all of the property of the church. And therefore, if you decide to leave the denomination, if you don't get permission in most states, not all states, but I think in most states, lots of states, the denomination can take all your property away from you. And the Episcopal Church has been extremely vindictive against any parish that has wanted to leave. And so a ton of people have lost their property. And so what I don't want to do, and I want to be careful to not do and explicitly reject, is the idea of criticizing any of these parishes that decided to leave the Episcopal Church for ACNA. I mean, these are people who counted the cost and paid the price and did what they did to decide to try to remain faithful as a church. So I want to honor that. I just do find it interesting that at the individual level, there has not been this migration of many of these elites away from some of these, Episcopal church, parishes into these ACNA churches. And again, I don't think many of the most fashionable churches, kind of Episcopal churches have left, again, because it's just one of the properties, it's just there. They've made it almost impossible to get out. You almost essentially can't get out. And so, I just wonder how many Orthodox people who are genuinely from the elite strata of American society, traditional Episcopalians, went over to one of these ACNA congregations. And I would love to hear, and this is partially a plea for information, send me names, send me information if you have it. All of the people, 100% of the people I know who are part of one of these ACNA churches are converts to Anglicanism. There's been a lot recently written about how there's been this big move of especially like Baptists for some reason, Southern Baptist types who've been moving into Anglicanism. I don't know all the details there, but everybody I know who attends one of these ACNA parishes is a convert to Anglicanism. And again, I was thinking about the same thing in Presbyterianism. Presbyterianism, it's been easier for churches to get out with their property, although I think that's changing. They're making it harder and harder and just restricting where you can go. But I thought about this. The Presbyterian Church in America is a conservative split-off of the main Presbyterian Church. It was the Southern Presbyterian Church at the time, because the Southern and Northern churches were divided. They merged in 1983. In the 1970s, a bunch of churches left and founded the Presbyterian Church in America. There's also a similar split-off group from the North called the EPC. And I was just thinking, how many flagship-type, high-prestige, large Presbyterian churches split off and went into the PCA? Basically almost none of them. And I was even looking down in Nashville, and there's a ton of PCA churches in Nashville. And, I was in Nashville, so I was looking around, but it looks like the most kind of prominent Presbyterian church in town is First Presbyterian. It's one of the 10 largest PCUSA congregations. It's mainline church. It's mainline Presbyterian. So I do know that, say, 10th Presbyterian, was kind of a famous church in Philadelphia, did that. But, really, I haven't heard that a lot of, call it the flagship establishment churches in the mainline Presbyterian moved into one of these splinter denominations. And again, in the North, I'm up in the North where virtually all of the PCA churches were plants, so it's different. Again, I'm asking, in the South, in the kind of the heartland of the PCA, how many, in like decent sized cities, not just small towns or small cities, in like real cities, how did any of the flagship type churches, who were the society church, if you will, move to the PCA? I'd be interested in hearing that. Now, there have been some of those churches that have moved into a kind of relatively new split off of the Presbyterian Church called ECO, which I think was founded in 2012. Highland Park Presbyterian in Highland Park, Texas, which is an extremely exclusive suburb of Dallas. They moved into ECO, and there's been a few. I think Menlo Park Presbyterian out in Silicon Valley is moving out there. So some of those kind of are moving, but this is like the first time I've seen what you might call really kind of flagship congregations move, and I just think it's really interesting. So it's interesting that kind of the legacy elites, call them the elites, and these kind of flagship churches have been very sticky to legacy denominations, and in part, that's because I think they really have a keen sense of the value, the cultural value. I did an entire podcast on mainline Protestantism. I did basically a series. It was, here's a couple good things about mainline Protestantism, or here's what we lost with mainline Protestantism. Here's some good things about fundamentalism. Here's some good things about the new Calvinism movement. I went through some of these things and highlighted some positives. And one of the things I mentioned was, the loss of essentially the decline of mainline Protestant denominations meant essentially the loss of the cultural center of America to Christianity. And to the extent that there still is a Christian presence in the cultural center, it's in these denominations. These people get it. And so if you kind of move into one of these splinter, more conservative groups, you're a little bit moving there because you've made peace with being outside of the cultural center, which again, I think in this world is certainly a defensible position. As I've said, the core aspect of the negative world is the hostility of the cultural center to Christianity. So can you even be there, and be a Bible-believing Christian, I think is a really interesting question. But essentially, I think the fact that there is kind of legacy of being at the cultural center makes those denominations sticky to people who come from these elite backgrounds and to those congregations. Now, I do think there has been an attempt by conservative Protestants to create elite-serving institutions. They usually don't talk about, hey, we're going to create an elite church. But what they'll say is, we want to plant a church in Manhattan, right? Or they'll say, we want to reach young professionals. So there's sort of some code words there. And then there are some organizations that are designed primarily to be elite-serving. So there's sort of a parallel set of Protestant infrastructure to serve elites in some cases. So some of you may be familiar with a ministry called Young Life, which serves high school students. And there's another organization called Focus that I think is very similar to Young Life, except they focus on serving kids from exclusive elite private schools. And, their kind of campground, their retreat center is on Martha's Vineyard. So you may have never heard of it, but there is this sort of elite Christian youth organization things. Similar, you've probably heard of campus organizations like Campus Crusade for Christ, InterVarsity Fellowship, or denominational ministries like Reformed University Fellowship, but there's also a campus ministry called Christian Union that is exclusively focused on the Ivy League. And I think some select other programs. I think they may have one at Stanford. I think they were trying to do one at USC's film school. So it's like, we want to reach the elite. And we feel like, because there are parallel sets of institutions in our society that serve the elite, we have to engage in a sense of parallel institutions there. I actually think it's not a bad thing. I'm not criticizing them. I actually think it's positive. And then again, there are churches that are de facto elite serving churches. So Emmanuel Anglican in New York City is a church that, I know has a lot of people you might qualify as elites or near elites there. Redeemer Presbyterian, a lot of, kind of like well-known people have gone there. I mentioned that the only evangelical Protestant that I knew that held a senior position in movement conservatism was Rich Lowry, who's the editor of National Review. He attended Redeemer for a period of time, which I don't mind sharing because he actually did an interview with Christianity Today about it, which is how I figured it out. He's another guy who was really kind of hard to figure out exactly what is this guy's religion. it's just not really straightforward. But then he did a big podcast where he talked with Christianity, all about his faith. It's very interesting. If you want to look it up, you can have it. I don't have the link handy, or I'd put it in the show notes. But again, I think Redeemer kind of feels more striver class than elite, to be quite honest. But nevertheless, what are some of the purposes, again, of elite organizations, right? One is they serve as kind of membership badges. So, like going back to my research on E.W. Baltzel, he talked about membership in the upper class. Again, he distinguished between the upper class and the elite. We're not going to talk about that here. But basically, it used to just be purely familial, what family you were from, and it became more associational over time. So what school you went to, Harvard, Princeton, Yale particularly, and the elite boarding schools, and what metropolitan clubs, what city clubs you belong to, much more defined membership in the upper class than, just family alone. And so getting into an Ivy League school, if you have a Harvard, Princeton, Yale on your degree, people are going to say, yes, this person is essentially a member of the elite. They got the right membership badge. Elite institutions also give you access to networks that are very important. They also perform, elite formation functions. So they socialize new upcoming members or, assimilating members of people into the code of manners of the elite. Now, in our case today, there's really not a code of manners. There's essentially an ideological code. So learning how to say all the right words and detect when, the zeitgeist is shift and keep up with all the ideological fashions. It's really an ideological code of manners today, you might say. And then it prepares them to be able to exercise rule, right? So if elites hold essentially rulership positions in society, CEO, governor, senator, president, Supreme Court justice, university president, pastor even, then you need to be prepared to essentially, rule well, to exercise authority well. And they're basically, the idea of all these things is, forming people into the code of manners and then also preparing them to be able to do that. So if we want to have a Protestant elite, we have to have things that mirror those sorts of elites. And actually, my impression is that Protestants do okay on a lot of these. Again, I mentioned some of these, organizations like Christian Union who are really reaching those things. They're creating networks, etc. But I think they're really too infected. I think the key limitation here is that Protestant elites are too infected with James Davison Hunter thinking, right? He has been very, very influential. This idea of faithful presence. And if you really want to learn more about faithful presence, go buy his 2010 book, To Change the World. Now, Hunter is a sociologist at the University of Virginia. He coined the term culture war, or at least popularized it. I'm not going to go into all this detail, but he studied evangelicalism for a very long time. I think his first book on it came out in 1982, 1983. And his books from the 80s are actually still quite illuminating. He was very prescient here. And so I kind of hate to criticize him because he's one of the Protestant thinkers that I really admire and have learned an awful lot from over the years. I really think he's just been super insightful. Now, I say he's Protestant. I'm sort of assuming he's Protestant. He gives off the air of being Protestant. He writes about evangelicalism. He's very good friends with Tim Keller, and they sort of have like a bromance in the acknowledgement sections of the books. And, he consults with Protestant churches. But again, here's a guy that, I Google around and just say, what is James Davison Hunter's actual religion? I wasn't able to find anything publicly stated about what his actual religion is. So it makes me think maybe he's an Episcopalian. Oh, he could be another one of these like shadowy Episcopalian figures. But I really like him, and I think he has a lot of insights. But this idea of faithful presence, I think really is kind of, it has a lot of good points. If you read To Change the World, what he's basically saying is, look, all of the theories of cultural change that these different groups have come out, the religious right, the liberal Christians, the neo-Anabaptists, their theories of cultural change are wrong. The things that they've tried haven't worked. Let me give you an alternate strategy that's aligned with how cultural change actually happens. And so he did that, and there's a lot to learn from it. The challenge, I think, is that strategy was very neutral world. It was very oriented towards this sort of pluralistic public square in which one could be a Christian, penetrate these elite organizations, become salt and light, transform them from the inside, etc. One is less applicable today than it was in the neutral world. And, secondly, there's a political scientist named Stephen Wolfe. I don't know if he talks about it in terms of faithful presence per se, but he's sort of got this quip. You should look up exactly what he says, to see how he would phrase it. That basically the purpose of sort of elite Christian formation is to create the conditions for Christianity to be tolerated in the negative world by essentially neutralizing Christianity as a threat to elite ideology, the new public religion, and to the regime. Therefore, basically, faithful presence has morphed. I'm not saying this was Hunter's original take, but it has sort of morphed into a theology of kind of going and, burying your head underground, keeping your head low, not rocking the boat, finding ways to avoid coming into conflict with culture. And as a result, what I observed is it's much more likely that when you attempt to, engage as elites in this environment, it is the culture that essentially catechizes and transforms the church much more than the church has transformed culture, which I don't see happening in any way. So I think that has been an area that's been a challenge. Another one that I think is that these Protestant groups have not developed what I call a theology of the exercise of authority. So the part about preparing people to rule, right, to actually exercise authority in a leadership position, domain, or society seems basically absent. I really can't detect it. In fact, I'm going to write an entire masculinist issue on this one, so I don't want to go into too much detail today. But it's one where, I saw this for sure in gender theology. These conservatives that have this idea of a complementarian gender theology, they sort of nominally will assent to the idea that, men are the head of the homes, men have authority in the homes, but they essentially deny that authority can be exercised in any material way. The sole thing for which you're, legally allowed to use your authority is service to your wife and children. This is almost explicitly stated in some place. There's really no place in this theology for any sort of legitimate self-assertion on the part of the husband, and there's very little missional orientation. As I said, it's an entirely inwardly focused theology. And I think one reason for that is if you tried to suggest that, the man's, got a mission outward focusing, you immediately get, can't women have a mission too? Can't women maybe act? So they don't want to get into all that. But essentially, there's very little about if you have authority, what would you actually exercise authority for? And again, this go back to the idea of a poor church for the poor. Yes, if you are in a position of authority, you could exercise it to, give money to the poor, participating in any sort of socially approved social cause. You could do that. You can, give money. You can build, houses, and that's all good. I'm all in favor of that stuff. But really, the idea of I am the governor of a state. And I am, a conservative Protestant, which is a common case, actually, in many states. How does my theology inform how I actually exercise the power of that office? And I don't see much written on that. I haven't personally taken a lot in. Maybe there's more out there. Again, if there's stuff I'm missing, send it my way. This episode is in part a plea for help. Get things coming in, because I think this is something we need to think about. And if I haven't seen it, there may be something out there, and I want to get it out there because this is an important topic of elite creation, formation, gospelization, if you will. But again, this authority idea is one that I'm germinating, and I'll probably do an entire masculinist on it. So I think creating a real Protestant elite, again, is critical to do. And I think that involves two separate but sort of overlapping items. One is the idea of a socio-economic, socio-political elite, which is basically what I've been talking about here. And then also the idea of creating an intellectual elite, which, is another task, if you will. I think, again, Hunter, assuming he's a Protestant of some kind, maybe an Episcopalian, would certainly count as an intellectual elite of Protestants, because he's someone that really can hold his own in the public arena, with the secular world. And we need to create a lot more of that. I'm all in favor of that. It's a little bit different than what I'm talking about here, where it's really call it more the ruling elder function than the teaching elder function, if you will. And again, I don't have all the answers, but I want to throw a few things out there that I think we need to do. One is that we do need to have churches that are focused on and comfortable with the idea that they are focused on reaching the elite. Doesn't mean they exclude anyone else. Doesn't mean that every church should be trying to reach the elite, but we at least need some churches that are much like, yeah, we're here to reach the elite. Because you know what? The elite of our society need the gospel of Jesus Christ just as much as anyone else. And maybe even more if you think about what Jesus said about how hard it was for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. They need the gospel of Jesus Christ too. And so we should not be ashamed to go into the nation of the elite, if you will, and make disciples of them as well. We have to do that. Secondly, I think we need to rethink and create a new form of Christian elite formation, particularly around the exercise of authority and networking. And one thing I think we need to do here is look back maybe at the previous generations of truly elite leaders who were shaped very heavily by a Protestant theological point of view. Now, most of them came from a mainline liberal position, but nevertheless were very powerful. I did an entire podcast a while back about a gentleman named J. Erwin Miller. J. Erwin Miller was, the fourth generation of the wealthiest and most prominent family in a town called Columbus, Indiana. They owned the biggest bank, which was the root of their fortunes. And then they created an industrial company that's still a gigantic Fortune 500 company today called Cummins Engine. You've probably seen those Cummins turbo diesel Ram pickups, for example. They make all kinds of diesel engines. And, he went to Yale, he went to boarding school, he was, on the board of the Ford Foundation, super, super, super elite guy, very wealthy. And he was also very shaped by the tradition of liberal Protestantism. And maybe not liberal Protestantism in the sense of truly theologically liberal Protestantism, although he was president of the National Council of Churches. But he came out of the Disciples of Christ denomination, which he stayed loyal to. He did not become an Episcopalian. He did not abandon his town. There was a certain conservative aspect. And basically, his town, because of what he did to lead and transform his town and set up this company to continue being very involved with and building up its town, is the only manufacturing city I know of in the entire Midwest that never went through a period of decline. It's the Rust Belt city that never rusted, as I like to call it. And guys like that, who were very, very, very influenced by their faith in everything that they did, and how that informed the way that they exercised authority in their domains of society, is very important. That doesn't mean that our theological positions are always going to be the same as their theological positions, but studying those previous generations of very religiously motivated, inspired leaders and how their theology informed how they exercised authority is very important. So that's an area of study, that we need to do. Again, I go back and listen to my podcast about Miller. He's a very interesting guy, and I think there's some aspects of his life that haven't even been fully studied yet. Maybe I'll do some study on that. Secondly, Protestants need to study the Catholics here. Again, Catholics have done, I think, a very good job of creating these institutions, creating these networks, and they've got these different theologies around Catholic social teaching, around this and that. And that's one reason it's been, I think, attractive to a lot of people. They've developed an intellectual elite. They've been much better at penetrating the cultural elite. And not just that, there are Catholics in high positions. There are a lot of Protestants in high positions too, but people who seem to have something of a motivated faith in Catholicism. So, again, he was Amy Coney Barrett, Supreme Court Justice. She was part of a Catholic intentional community called People of Praise, in South Bend when she was at Notre Dame. So we're talking about somebody who has some very motivated Catholic leanings. And what have the Catholics done right? What can we learn from that? No need to invent the wheel. So there's there. And then I think also our Episcopalian friends need to kind of come out of the shadows a little bit, not necessarily to, leave their denominations or leave their churches, but it really does seem like the elites who are in these Episcopal churches, people who are from elite backgrounds, who are still, pretty theologically solid people, have decided to essentially go into hiding a little bit. And so I think they could come out and being marinated, particularly people who are cradle Episcopalians, what is there to learn from the way that that church functions, from the way that they have been a key institution of elite formation and the exercise, kind of elite authority in America? It's important. These are people who are already elites, who are already in these key institutions, and how can they become more activated, even if they are not people who would ever be necessarily culturally or kind of otherwise, really tight with the evangelical crowd. They've maybe come from a different sensibility, but still very much hold firm to the faith. I think those are some things there. So those, again, I always like to come up with, not just kind of critiques, not just with analysis, but what are some practical to-dos for us? And a lot of these I'm probably not going to be able to completely take on. Again, American Reformer, the nonprofit that I've helped to launch, is very much targeted at intellectual elite, becoming much more intellectually elite. We need organizations like that. There's a little socio-political elite, this is, maybe there's some overlap, but things we need to do. So I'm trying to do some things, but this is one I think we need to have some thinking. And I know several of you probably in some of these elite churches. I got some listeners in New York and these other places. Think about that. I think we need to rethink about how we, reach and disciple the elites. And so thank you much again. And again, just close it out with a reminder during, the Christmas season, please do consider becoming a subscriber or a member. You can do it on patreon.com/masculinist, gumroad.com/masculinist. There's great benefits, and it's a limited time offer to get in on the ground floor at a great price. Please do it. Please leave a rating on iTunes if you haven't already. And next week, tune in for what will hopefully be the conclusion of what turned into a mini-series on elites. Thanks.